for a moment here about Nexmo. One of our longtime sponsors, really been behind Laracon Online from the beginning. Great to have them on board again. So if you're doing anything with communication, which most of us are in our apps, you know, if you're sending, receiving phone calls, sending, receiving messages or SMS, you know, different types of authentication, all that stuff, Nexmo provides all that. So you definitely want to check them out. And this year they've actually doubled the amount of the offer they usually provide. So now it's a 20 euro credit. So it's not going to cost you anything. Go over there, give it a shot. If you have to do any of those things in your app, just try Nexmo for free and give it a go. It's, you know, they have all the APIs and packages and everything you need to make it really easy to work with Laravel, and give them a look. So thanks again to Nexmo. Okay, let's grab Caleb. There he is.
Hey, howdy, hey.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you, Ian?
Good. Was a lot of excitement for your talk. So you ready to go?
Absolutely. Very ready.
All
very
right.
excited.
All right, let's do it. Take it away.
All right. See my screen good?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Great. So hello, everybody. Thanks for having me at Laracon Online. Super exciting. I'm Caleb Porzio. I'm a Laravel developer, community member, guy. That's that. And I run a podcast with my buddy Daniel called No Plans to Merge, where mostly every Friday we hang out and we talk about code and other such fun things. It's very cool. Give it a listen if you care. So I want to take you on a bit of a journey. This talk is pretty special to me. It's kind of a culmination of a lot of work for me. And a little bit ago, more specifically, 31,000 Composer installs ago, 20,000 lines of code, 2,000 hours, more than 2,000 hours of work, 1.9 thousand GitHub stars, 1.2 thousand commits, 271 merged pull requests, 90 GitHub sponsors, 67 tagged releases, 45 contributors, 8 meetups, 3 conference talks, and 1.09 years of my life ago, I started working on a little project that I call Livewire. You may have heard of it, may have not, but Livewire is a full stack framework for Laravel. The goal is to take the pain out of building dynamic front ends in Laravel. I'm a full stack developer. I've been using Vue.js for my front ends for like 5 years now. And I've just sort of started to step back from big tools like that and felt a lot of pain released. And Livewire is sort of my magnum opus, my response to that, my way forward. So today, we are going to tag Livewire 1.0. It is finally ready for you to all go and install in production. But first, let's check it out. Let's look at the code. All right, so here's GitHub. Here's the manage access portion of the Livewire repo on GitHub. And if you go to this invite teams or people, there's a little modal that pops up. We start searching, and there's a little loading wheel, and it's searching the entire GitHub database for usernames, and it's showing them and displaying them. So it's a pretty simple little widget or doodad, but to create it, you can't just do native form submissions and Blade. So you'd need some sort of dynamic interactive behavior. So you might reach for something like Vue or React. That's what I would have done. But like you've probably seen my little party trick in some other talk or something, GitHub behind the scenes doesn't actually do that. So you would think that when I type in a letter like O, it's going to send a request to the server with the query, which it does. So it's sending off Taylo, and it's going to get back JSON. And then some front-end framework is going to take that JSON and render a template. Well, that's actually not what happens. The template gets rendered in the back end, and we just get raw HTML as a response. And then that raw HTML gets swapped into the page by whatever tool that GitHub uses to do that. Sometimes they're just using plain JavaScript. So it's a really powerful pattern. And when I first encountered it, it started to really rock my world. Like I used it in one little corner of my app, and then I started to use it in other places and other ways, and discovered that this is like one of the most powerful patterns I've probably encountered ever in web development. TurboLinks, if you've heard of that, is basically built on this. PJAX is built on this. Intercooler is built on this. GitHub is built on this. Basecamp's built on this. There's so many things that use this pattern. And Livewire basically is a framework for this exact pattern. So let's build a little UI component just like this. It's going to be a little bit different, but basically just like this, and do it all with Livewire. So instead of searching for users, we're going to create a little search repos component. Let's jump in. Here is a plain vanilla Laravel application. There's pretty much nothing done to it. Here's the root endpoint, and it points to the welcome blade view. So this welcome blade view is pretty simple. There's one style sheet that I did to make this demo look pretty, but that's it. Don't think that there's all this magic happening under the hood yet. Dun, dun, dun. All right, so let's install Livewire. That's our first step. Now pay close attention to all the install steps. It's kind of a bear to get installed. It's going to take you like an hour and a half, but that you only have to do it once. So composer, require, yeah, I'm actually going to take the hour and a half here. I didn't tell Ian or warn him, but sorry about that. Composer, require, Livewire, Livewire, hit enter. Composer is really slow, so we're just going to pretend I hit enter. And now you add two tags, Livewire styles. That's going to be all the style sheets that Livewire needs, and then Livewire scripts. And we are done. Sarcasm and jokes are so much lamer on Laracon Online. You need to have a laugh track, you know, feed off the crowd. All right, so that is it. The Livewire is completely installed in the app. That's it. We're totally done. You compose a require, you add this line, and you add this line, and you are off to the races, which I think is really cool. And I want everybody to really know that there's no config file to publish. You could if you wanted, but there's no config file necessary. There's no middleware. There's no WebSocket server. There's nothing big and confusing that you think there might be. Great. So let's create our first component. We're going to call it search repos. Now you include a Livewire component pretty much like you would a blade include, and it works very much like a blade include for the first render. So you'll see what I mean. We'll create search repos. All right. And now there's a handy dandy little artisan command, artisan make Livewire search repos. And now we have two files newly created. There's a class, searchrepos.php, and then there's a blade view, searchrepos.blade. So this is it. This is all we need for a Livewire component. It's a plain PHP class that extends this Livewire component class and has one method, the render method, which you probably saw and are familiar with from Taylor demoing the new Blade component. So there's a lot of symmetry between Livewire components and current Blade components. Thanks a lot to Taylor for doing that. All right, awesome. So here's our render method, and here is our Blade view. And everything inside the Blade view is it's plain Blade. So anything you can do in Blade, I want you to know that you can totally do it inside of Livewire. So let's write hello world and make sure that this thing frickin' works. Hello world, refresh, and it works. So like I said, for the first render, it's pretty much like a blade include. So we don't want to inspect. Let's actually view page source. So this is pre-JavaScript load, just what comes from the server. There is hello world. So Livewire is totally SEO friendly. It just adds some extra magic that we'll be taking advantage of in a minute. So let's create our little search input, placeholder, search repos. Okay, check that out on the page. Here's our search repos box. Great. Now let's do, well, actually, before we do the magic, we're going to want to show a bunch of repositories. So why don't we do that? Let's pass in some repositories into the Blade view. And so far, you're pretty much thinking of this like a normal Blade component or even like a controller. So we're just passing data into a view. Repos, and then repo all. And now here, I should have a little snippet, so you don't have to watch me struggle with at for each. But we're at for eaching through those repos in a UL, and then each LI is going to be a different repo name. So if we load this on the page, there we go. There's all our repos. Now comes the magic. So far, there's no magic. This is nothing more than a fancy Blade component. Well, in Vue, if you wanted to build this out in Vue, you have this input element. You would want to bind this data and make some server call. So you might do something like vmodal equals search. And then inside of your Vue component, you might do something like data return search is empty string. It just like torrentially started downpouring here. So I'm gonna close the door. I want you all to meditate on the code I'm about to write. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit better. All right. So in Vue, you would do vmodal search, and then you would have something like this. Well, Livewire should feel very similar to this, but instead of vmodal, you're going to do wire model. That's going to be in the front end. And then instead of a data property, it just stores these properties as public class properties. So we'll say search equals empty string. Okay. And now with any luck, Livewire is going to keep the value of this input element in sync with this backend search property. Now, conceptually, this should probably bend your brain right now. You're probably thinking this is, if you haven't seen it already, you're thinking this is wild, this is magic, this is weird, but bear with me. Okay, so you're not gonna actually be able to see it because search is empty string. So let's set it to foo. All right, and now foo is magically already booted up with foo. And let's actually echo out that search value. And just like normal Blade components that you just saw, the public properties are made automatically available to the Blade view. So there's foo, and now watch this. I'm gonna type bar, and there we go. It's automatically updating as I type. Now what's happening in the back end, or what's happening in the background? Every time we're typing, there's a debounce automatically, so we're not sending a request on every keystroke, but I let off the keyboard and we sent an AJAX request to the backend. And that request had a query. Search is foob. That's a funny word. And then we got back a bunch of rendered HTML. So this is the exact pattern that you just saw GitHub using all over the place. It's that server fetched partials pattern. Livewire is a framework for that. So Livewire is taking this initial data, sending it to the backend, seeding up your component with that current state, rendering the Blade view, spitting it back out, and swapping it onto the page. And so I think it's important to understand how this works because it gives you a good framework for what Livewire is. It's not just a weird pile of magic. It's a framework built around this concept of sending data to the server, filling some class or something, rendering a Blade view, and changing the page. And that's, when you think about it, you're doing that yourself when you're using Vue and you're sending AJAX requests. The templating is just happening on the front end. Anyhow, okay, so there's our magic. Let's do something useful with this. So we have search in the background, and search is set to foo. So let's say instead of repo all, we'll say repo search. I created a nice little macro, so you don't have to watch me write out a database query. Search, and we can just pass in this search. Okay, get ready. We refresh. Now nothing shows because there's no repo called foo. I'm going to hit the back button and type L. Okay, now we have L. I have to refresh the page so you don't see that. Oh, I didn't save this Blade view. Okay, type L, and there we go. We have every repository that has L in it, which happens to be every single one, I think. So LI, LA, and there you go. Now you're seeing it. So we have built real-time searching with like almost no effort at all. The only thing that's a little bit different here is this wire model, and it's pretty intuitive if you're familiar with Vue. Very cool. So let's keep going. Let's say that we wanted to seed this component with some initial data, like we wanted it to say Livewire. So in Vue, you might like have a component called search repos, and you might pass in a property called, you know, whatever, initial search. So in Livewire, there's a mount lifecycle hook, and you can kind of think of this like the constructor of a Blade component, or just a constructor, or maybe the mounted hook of a Vue component. This runs on the initial page render when it's first booting up this component. So we can accept a parameter called initial search. We'll default it to an empty string, and then we'll set this search equals initial search. Okay, and now back in the welcome view, we can pass in this parameter again, just like a Blade component. So we'll say initial search is Livewire. Okay, load it on the page, and there we go. We have Livewire seated up right there. So let's say we also wanted to drive out this value from the query string. So you could type search equals Laravel, hit enter, and then this value gets pulled from the query string. But like I said before, the mount method is part of the initial request. It's part of the initial page load. So like a controller, in the mount method, you actually have access to Laravel's request. And you can also dependency inject stuff if you're into that sort of thing. But I'm kind of a helpers guy myself. So request search. And then the default, if there's nothing passed in, will be initial search. So now if I hit enter, this should now say Laravel. And it does. Great. So that takes us about halfway there. Now if I change this, it didn't update the query string automatically. And when you need to do something like that, like if you're doing that in Vue, you might have to mess with like history, like push state, like stuff like that, which can get really hairy and annoying. And I don't know, that's one of those things that I've had to do in the past. And every time I get to that point, I'm like, all right, I'll roll up my Stack Overflow sleeves, I'll buckle down, and I'll try to get this thing working good enough. But I feel like I'm, you know, hand rolling something that shouldn't be hand rolled. So Livewire provides a nice little API out of the box called updates query string. And you can pass in a list of public properties that you want to be kept in synchronized with what's in the query string. So we can pass in search. All right. And now it's Laravel, which we expected. And if I remove half of this, check out this query string. Now it's LAR, and the query string updated to LAR. So now if I refresh, it stays that way. Nice. Awesome. So that makes that part easy. And that is it. We created a nice little search component with a bunch of declarative APIs. Okay, one last little like cherry on top. Let's say we want to add a little loading wheel like we saw on GitHub. We'll wrap this input element in a div, and we'll give it an isLoading class. Div is loading. All right, loaded in the browser, and there's our loading indicator sitting right there. Now, to make this only show when a network request is sent out, if you were in Vue, you would do something like this loading equals true, right? Like this imperative code where you'd have your Axios request, and then inside of a then or a catch, you do this loading equals false. And then you're like, well, is it loading, or do I do this dot ready and v-if loading? And you're managing all that stuff by hand. So in Livewire, there's a wire::loading API. So you can wire::loading dot class. You could do dot attribute to disable things. You could even take an entire div and set wire::loading on it, and it will only show when the page is loading. And there's no flicker. It's automatically hidden by default. Okay, so we have that now. I'm going to crank our network down to slow 3G so that you can see this. Well, first, before I'll refresh the page with fast. Okay, now I'm cranking it down to slow 3G, and I'm going to type, let's say, error. Okay, now you see the loading indicator, then it comes back, and the loading indicator disappears. Awesome. So we have another declarative API. You're not imperatively managing the state of loading. It's declarative. Same thing with declaratively managing what's going to update the query string, and declaratively managing when we should send some data to our server to refresh the page. Great. So I love this paradigm. This is kind of the hello world of Livewire. So the last final thing here, I want to show you how Livewire has an awesome little testing suite. So you can wrap this stuff in tests really nicely. Artisan make test, search repos test. Create the test. Now we'll go to it, search repos test. Okay, now here we go. We're going to write our first test. It's going to say can search repos. It's a happy path. So we're going to have to create some repos. So we'll start with, let's create one called foo with the name of foo, and the other one with the name of bar. Great. Now here comes the Livewire stuff. I'm going to use the Livewire facade ::test to wrap that search repos component inside of a little test wrapper. So search repos. And now we can make assertions on the rendered DOM, just like you would if you made a plain request in Laravel's testing suite, like this get kind of thing, and then you would tack on assert don't see or something. It's the same thing. So we're going to say assert don't see. We don't want to see anything right away. So we don't see foo, we don't see bar. Now we want to interact with the component. We want to set the property to something. So we're going to set the search property to, let's say, to foo. And now because we set it to foo, we should see foo and we shouldn't see bar. So we're going to say assert cfoo. Assert cfoo. I feel cfoo, is that like a character from Kung Fu Panda? I don't know. All right, so we assert cfoo and assert don't see bar. I'm going to run this test. And we are green. Fantastic. We are green. Wonderful. So this test right here, this is another one of those moments to pause and reflect on the universe. Right now, we wrote a little test, but we tested dynamic interaction in the full stack. We tested all the way from the database to a blade template, which to me is maybe the most compelling case for a framework like Livewire, or at least patterns like Livewire uses. Because if you change something here, if we just break this template, if this were a Vue template, our PHP unit tests wouldn't know. We catch them in maybe dusk tests, and those are, you know, like you shouldn't, I'm guessing you're not wrapping your entire site in dust tests because they're very slow. Undefined variable reo. So now we're getting meaningful feedback, full stack meaningful feedback really fast. I love this. Another common thing here, let's say we had profile that was an intermediate eloquent relationship, and for some reason it didn't exist. How many times does this happen to us? For me, honestly, it's the most common error that I encounter in my Laravel apps. Check out this error. If you don't get shivers reading this error, you're not a human or you haven't been in Laravel long enough. Trying to get property name of non-object. Am I right? like paired with Eloquent. This is not the fault of Eloquent. This is just a side effect of applications. Maybe there's people sitting there, you know, criticizing dynamic languages, and you might be right. But check this out. We hit this in our test, and yeah, you got shivers, but your test caught it. So let's say that this was a view component, and you had like repo.profile.name. And the data wasn't passed in properly, like that relationship didn't exist. So check this out. Rollbar has an article called Top 10 JavaScript Errors from 1,000+ Projects. Number one, what is number one? It's the JavaScript equivalent. Uncaught type error, cannot read property. It's the exact same thing. Cannot read property, bar of undefined. And Rollbar says a common issue that causes this is improper initialization of state while rendering the UI components, which is exactly what we just ran into. So for me, this is an incredibly compelling case for building my apps this way. It contributes to simplicity and just general reliability of my apps. Great. Okay, let's keep moving. And before we move any further, I want to note this @Livewire thing, I think is pretty ugly. I also think @component is ugly. And I think @include is ugly. I don't get, maybe @include's not so bad, but look at all this. It's all this white. I don't get syntax highlighting unless I install the Blade package for VS Code, which I'm personally not a huge fan of because it messes with my autocomplete. Okay, @Livewire. So the new Laravel 7, you just saw that really sexy syntax like this. So I wanted something similar for Livewire. So check it out. Livewire : and now we can say search repos. And we can do the same thing that you can do with normal Blade components. Search, Livewire, make it self-closing, and that's it. Check it out. Still works. Everything is all good, and it's beautiful. And it also works up here. We can say Livewire, Livewire styles, and Livewire scripts. Beautiful. So much more aesthetically pleasing to me and easy to search and scan. I love it. All right. So the next step here, we're going to create a create repo little UI component. We want like a field up here where we can type in a repo name, like some new package, and then hit enter and add that package, and then we can search it. So it's a create repo component. So let's do that. Livewire create repo. Great. Now for this component, we're going to totally TDD it because again, the testing features of Livewire to me are some of the most compelling cases for it for me personally. I love a TDD workflow and I love that Livewire totally supports it. So Livewire make test, create, repo, test. All right, there's our test. We'll go into it, create repo test. And let's add our first test, the happy path test. We're going to say can create repo. So now we're in a TDD flow. And honestly, a lot of times, this is how I like to start writing a feature because I don't have to worry about the implementation. I can just sit here and look at the screen and think about how I want to interact with the component. Great. So Livewire : test. We're going to boot up the create repo component. And now I think to myself, how's this component going to work? What's the typical user scenario? What's the happy path flow through this component? Well, I imagine we'll have an input element that says name, and a user will type into that. So we'll need to set a property called name to something, let's say foo. And this will sort of simulate a user typing in foo to the input. And then let's say they submit a form by hitting enter or clicking a button that calls a method on the component called create. So we're going to need one of those. And then after that, let's just assert in the database that a new one exists. We'll say assert true repo where name is foo exists. Okay, and now we have a full stack test from the database to the template. Run can create repo, and we get our first failure. So this might be a little bit annoying for some people watching, but for me, I take like great satisfaction from watching a good TDD workflow where we mindlessly follow the errors until we get something working. So unable to find component create repo, let's do it. Artisan make Livewire create repo. Great, we have our new files created. We have the class, oops, and we have the Blade view. Okay, now we can sit here and just rerun the last test. What's the new error? Unable to set component data. Public property name not found on component. Really good error messages. They tell us exactly what to do. Name equals empty string. Rerun the test, and what's the error this time? Unable to call component method. Public method create not found on component create repo. So let's add that. Create. All right, and our last and final failure is failed asserting that false is true because it doesn't exist in the database. So let's do that work right here. We have repo, and we'll just create it. We'll say name, set name to the current value inside the name property. Rerun our tests, and now we're green. Great. So let's build out the front end and check this thing out. Create our form, our input field with placeholder of name, and then a button that's going to say create repo. Okay. And now this is just a plain bootstrapped, not bootstrap, Tailwind, but just plain scaffolding here. It's not interactive. Let's wire it up to our Livewire component. So first we're going to do that wire model equals name, and this is going to bind the value of whatever's inside of this input element to the name property. And now when we submit the form, we want to intercept that submission. So in Vue, you would do something like v_on_submit.prevent, so you're not submitting the actual form, and then you would use the create method. And you could pass like parameters to it or whatever you want. So Livewire works with the same exact API. We can say wire submit.prevent fire the create method. So this should be good enough for us. Let's check it out in the browser. So it's defaulting to some new package because of our query string thing. All right, so I'm going to type foo, hit enter. Nothing seemed to happen, but if we search F, we now see foo. Great. So we want to clear this after we hit enter. And this is a pattern you've probably encountered in Vue. After you submit something or post something to the server, you do something like this, name equals empty string. So we're doing the same thing just with Livewire. We can set that to empty string. So now when I hit foo, and notice actually, this is something I'm going to probably keep drawing your attention to. I just changed the component. I'm not going to refresh the page. I'm just going to hit create repo. And notice we see it right away. Because it's a stateless server round trip, we rarely have to actually refresh the page to see a change take effect, which I love. It's like hot reloading without any build process. All right, so let's refactor this a tiny bit. We have this name equals empty string. We've cleared that input. Now again, if you've done this in Vue, you might feel a little bit nasty about this. It's something that I always felt a little bit off about. And let's say you have like 6 different pieces of data and you have to clear all of them. The knowledge, this is a duplication of knowledge. The knowledge of what the initial state of this property is stored in 2 places. So I created a nice little helper, this reset, and Livewire will reset all the properties back to their initial state, and you can target a specific one by passing in that parameter. So we refactored, let's test it out. Bar, hit enter, worked, search for bar is right there. Great. All right, let's show some success message so that when we create this repo, we'll see a little flash message. Okay, so in a controller, you're probably used to flashing some message into the session. So you'd say session, arrow, flash. We'll make the key message, and this will be create did repo. Okay, and then inside your blade view, you might have something like @if session has message, Or more likely, you just have a blade include that does this automatically. So I have one too. It's called flash messages. And I will flash that to you right now so you can see it. It's pretty simple. I just saved you the typing. Session has message. It's a little alert that I made with the message from the session. Great. So when I hit create, it's going to hit this method. It's going to flash this into the session. And Livewire is smart enough to let us use it right away. Great. And if you redirected, it's another thing. You could actually redirect from a method using normal redirect stuff like to. And that data would also be flashed in the session so that on the new page, your flash include would pick it up. So let's test it out. Again, I'm going to not refresh the page, and fingers crossed. Let's create something. Baz, hit enter, and there we go. Success, created repo. And now we look in the database, and we have Baz. Very nice. All right, now let's tackle validation. Let's say we want some validation, so you can't create an empty one, you can't create a duplicate one, things like that. But we're going to test drive this one out to show you how nice the validation testing is. So back to the test. Let's copy this entire test. And we're going to call this name. Oops, where'd the mouse go? We're going to call this name or hname, name is required. Okay. And now we test create repo, but we're going to set foo to an empty string. Then we're going to call create. And now instead of asserting something in the database, we're going to call an assertion that you might be already familiar with. Assert has errors, the name field. So this is the same exact assertion that, again, if you were doing normal Laravel testing, you would do this, get or post, and then on the response, you would assert has errors. Livewire uses the same exact conventions. Okay, name is required. There's our test. Let's jump into the TDD loop. Component has no errors. Well, let's make that happen. So before we create it, let's think. If you were in a Laravel controller and you wanted to do some validation, Laravel validation is awesome now. You can just do request, arrow validate, and then you might do something like name required, right? And then because request arrow validate returns valid data if it passes, and because you might just be passing that data into here, you might be like, ooh, let's inline that and make it super, super sexy. And that is super, super sexy. So we have request arrow validate, but that doesn't actually work in Livewire because it's not the mount method. You don't have access to the original request. So Livewire has a little helper, this arrow validate, and it works the exact same way. It has the same API and it returns the same exact things. You can add custom messages after, you can do whatever you want. You could even throw a validation exception. All right, let's rerun the test and see if we get passing. And we do. And now to implement this in the front end, it's the same situation as before. It uses Laravel's default message bag stuff. It's error bag. So you could say like if errors or at if errors has, or sorry, any, you know, and then you do like has and all and whatever, stuff like that. Or you could use the fancy little error helper. We can say error name, spit out the message and end error. So we can do the same exact thing. If you have a blade include for this, if you have a component for validation messages, if all of your inputs are wrapped up in the blade component anyway, it's all just going to work interchangeably. So let's see this thing work. I'm not going to refresh the page. I'm just going to hit create repo. And there we go. The name field is required. Awesome. So there's some validation for that. Let's add some uniqueness. So let's say we don't want to be able to add two foos. So right now we have bar and baz. Let's add bar again. And you'll notice that did it let us? No, because we ran a test and cleared the database. We'll do it again. And now we have two bars. So let's add some unique constraint. Unique repos. Okay. If you're not familiar with that, unique is a validation available to you automatically in Laravel, and you pass in the table you want to test for uniqueness on. Okay. And now we type bar, hit enter, and it says the name has already been taken. Perfect. So that's great, but pretty often with things like that, like a repository name, actually, this is what a coincidence that the demo perfectly lines up with something GitHub does. So repository name, inside of your little, repo settings, if you try to pick something that already exists, it real-time validates for you and says the repository docs already exists on this account. So this is something that's pretty common with like a username field or anything that's unique that a user would want to know before they send the entire form request over. So let's TDD this out. Let's make a new test, and it's going to be name is unique as user types. Good enough for me. We set the name to empty, but before we even call create, we want to make sure that we see that error. We'll run our test. We're going to get our failure. Okay. Now, what do we do here? So this is something that's a little bit outside the normal flow. And again, this is one of those scenarios where it might, if you were doing this with normal form submissions, you might be pushed into the world of Vue.js or React or some front-end framework like that where you go, well, now this is the thing. This is the dynamic interactive UI that I got to go there for. So Livewire makes these kinds of things really, really simple. So you can hook into the Livewire lifecycle and be able to do something like this really easily. So there's an updated hook. And this runs anytime a property on the Livewire component is updated. And if you want to scope this hook to only this property, you can suffix it with the Studley cased property name. Okay, so updated name is only going to run when we are updating the name property. So what are we doing here? Well, we can just run the exact same validation that we did over here. And you could customize it so you're only running certain validation rules every update in real time, and then your normal validation runs with the form submission. So let's check it out. I'm going to hit backspace. Now I'm going to type R, and I ran the test so it cleared the database. We'll create bar, now BA. Now as soon as I type R, we get real-time validation. And I don't think I got the test to pass, so let me show you that that passes. Oh, it does not pass. Why does it not pass? Did I not save something? Because I didn't create a repo. I can't believe you let me do that. Create the repo foo, set name to foo, run the test, and assert that we have errors. Okay, this is all fine and well, but when I'm testing validation rules like this, I'm pretty unsatisfied because my assertion is pretty weak. It's like assert has error's name. It's just asserting that there is a name value error, which to me is not super great because check this out. Let's say instead of unique repos, I test min6 because foo is 3 characters. It's still going to pass because it's going to say, yeah, we found a validation error. So I added this extra little helper API to the assert has errors method. You can use the key of the field and then the value of specific validation rules. So now we're saying assert has errors unique. Okay? Component has no unique errors for the name attribute. Beautiful. So now we revert back to unique repos. We run and we get passing. Very nice. All right, I think we have a nice little component setup here. We have a nice create component, a nice search component. It's all real-time validated, pretty easy, fully tested. Good, we're doing really well. But this page is kind of nasty. We're bloated it up a little bit. Let's say we wanted to put this inside of a modal so that you click a button like create repo and then a modal pops up like GitHub did when we were on manage access. It said invite teams or people. There's a modal. And I'm pretty sure that it didn't send a full AJAX request when we hit that modal, when we went to show the modal. So if you wanted to do something like this, you could do it in Livewire. You could actually do button, wire, click, show modal, and then you could have a method that's like show modal with a public property like open equals false, right? You could actually do something like that. But in my mind, that's an abuse of the framework. Like it's abusing Livewire because, I don't know, it just feels so heavy-handed. We're making a full server round trip to show a modal. I don't think users expect to wait, anywhere from 100 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds to show a dang modal or a dropdown or switch between tabs or a date picker. There's lots of these little ephemeral interactions that you expect to be snappy and instant. And those types of things are better left to JavaScript. So for me personally, this is something I wrestled with since the beginning of Livewire. I thought, okay, at first I pushed it a little bit too far. And then I scaled back and I went, well, what do I use for this stuff? Because when we all used Bootstrap, you just went to the Bootstrap docs and copy and pasted a big chunk that said modal, right? And dropdown, pasted it in and you were good to go. But now we're using Tailwind and Balma and tools that don't give you any JavaScript out of the box. So what do? And to me, I felt like there was this massive gap between, on the one hand, we have vanilla JavaScript. And on the other hand, we have a huge framework like Vue or React. I wanted something in the middle for cases like a freaking modal or a dropdown. So I wrote a tool. It's called Alpine JS. It's a rugged, minimal framework for composing JavaScript behavior in your markup. I think of it like Tailwind for JavaScript. It's like this little JavaScript Swiss Army knife. All right, so I'm going to show it to you before we go any further. First, we're going to install Alpine. Here's actually the way I recommend installing it. It's a one script with a CDN link. I don't know, npm install to me is the moment when JavaScript got really, really hard. This little script tag, love it. If you want it in your project, download the JavaScript and then put it in a script tag. Cool. You can also npm install it if you're not a hater like I am. Okay, let's install this thing. Save changes? Yes, please. Here's our welcome page. Ready? Here is the hour-and-a-half Alpine installation. Bam. We are done installing Alpine. There's no alpine.start or a init where you wonder, oh, do I put this in like document.add event listener, right? There's none of that. It's just initialized. Okay, now let's do a little hello world for Alpine. So we'll make a counter. This is a mistake I made with Livewire. The hello world for Livewire used to be a counter with a button, like a plus and minus button, but I would never build a counter in Livewire. I would build it in Alpine. So let's do it in Alpine. Plus, minus, and then a span tag to show the number. All right, and then inside of here, let's say we were building this in Vue. How would we do this in Vue? You would wrap this up in a template tag. It'd be like template, sorry, it would already be wrapped up. This is inside your single file Vue component. and you would return or export default, and then there would be data, right? And then return, and then this would be count 0, and then you would have some methods, and those would be like increment and decrement and things like that. Yep, that's how you do it in Vue. So keep that mental model. Now here's how we're going to build it in Alpine. You define an Alpine component right in an attribute called xData, and you just pass in the initial data. So count 0. All right, let that sink in. This is how you initialize and define an Alpine component on a page. This is the data that you seed it with. It's everything I want for little simple interactions. All right, now what about actually interacting with some things inside of the component? All right, if we want to increment count, when we hit the plus button in Vue, you would do v-on click count plus plus, or fire some method. v-on click equals count minus minus. And then here it would be like v-text equals count, right? All right, so x hyphen, Alpine uses x hyphen instead of v hyphen. So you can pretty much use most of Vue's API with x hyphen. And in fact, for these types of things, you can use Vue's little @ or colon binding helpers. So it almost feels exactly like Vue. If you already know how to use Vue.js, you know how to use Alpine. All right, moment of truth. Refresh, here's our counter. There we go. We have a basic counter functionality with no npm install, with no npm run watch. It just works. All right, so Alpine happens to work beautifully with Livewire. You can take any Alpine component and you can shove it inside a Livewire component. So this is all out of the box. Let's shove this in between the input element and then the list of repos. Refresh. And now as we type L for Livewire, we're making requests, right? We're making requests to the server. Well, let's increment this component. Now we have some state in the DOM. We make another request and the state is preserved. Livewire is smart enough to sort of step around Alpine. They work really, really well in conjunction with each other. Cool. So again, Alpine is like a Swiss Army knife. There's so many little cool things I want to demo for you, but there's just not time. That's a whole other talk. If you wanted to, like, you could turn this into a component if you wanted to make, like, let's say a little character counter. You could do like x data equals, I don't know, like char count, and default it to, I don't know, an empty string. And then inside here, we'll say x text equals char count. There's 100 ways you could do this. There's actually X modals, so you could just X model on this. But for us, let's listen for an input event, and then we'll say char count equals the event.target.value.length. All right, so it's a little bit of deep JavaScript-y stuff, whatever, but I'm just kind of demonstrating to you what's going on here. And now we have a character count, because Livewire is not good at stuff like that. That's not what it's meant for. In my mind, Livewire is for the things that require AJAX requests normally in Vue, or that heavily benefit from using Blade in your template, and then Alpine for all the rest. That's my new prescription. Okay, let's back out of that and let's create that modal that I talked up so highly. All right, creating the modal. We're going to comment this out for now, and let's write our modal markup. Div.modal, and we'll make a button and give it a class of btn, and this is going to be, we'll just say show modal. All right, now div overlay, and then inside of it, we're gonna have div content, and this will be modal content. All right, now this is just the CSS and HTML, and there we go. It does absolutely nothing. It's totally dumb. This is just the CSS. Now let's use Alpine to make this thing behave. Great, so we'll make this a component, xData, and now open is false. Okay, and now this button, the show modal button, we're gonna listen for a click and we'll say open equals true. Okay, and then let's just test that and see how we're doing. Okay, it didn't work off the bat because the demo gods are against me right now. Oh, because I didn't add xShow. You all saw that, didn't you? There we go, hit show modal. There we go, it's shown. All right, but we want to hide it now. So you generally expect that you can hit escape or you can click on the overlay to close a modal, right? So let's do that. Let's add a click equals open equals false to the overlay, which should hide this for us. Refresh and make sure this works. We show it, we click on the overlay, and there it worked, it hid it for us. But if we click on modal content, it also hides it, which is not what we want. So if you've done this in Vue.js, there are tons of tutorials on making modals in Vue.js. It's not easy work. You would do @click.stop, and this would stop the propagation of the click event from bubbling up to the overlay. So Alpine is built for these common cases. I wanted to build it to be a framework that you could at least make a dropdown or a modal very easily. So we can do click.away. And now, anytime you're clicking away from the element the dot away is on, it will run this expression. We render it in the browser, show modal. Clicking in modal content doesn't do anything. Clicking in the overlay hides it. Very nice. Let's add that little key down listener so that we can hit escape and close it. Key down.escape equals open equals false. Now in Vue.js, again, this is one of those things in those tutorials, like Adam Wathan literally has a big tutorial series on creating modals in Vue. It's like multi-step, it's this whole thing. And you have to do things like, because you want to listen for the key down on the global window, because you don't know where the user's focus is going to be, you have to manually add the events. You'd be like document.add event listener, and this would be like key down, and you'd be like, how do I filter keys? E.key code. What's the key code, right? All that. So Alpine gives you this little modifier called window. You can just do .window, and now this listener is attached to the global window instead of this element. Let's check it out. Hit show modal, hit escape, and we closed it. Very nice. All right, the last little icing on the cake here is transitions. Transitions are historically annoying. Well, I created a little API in Alpine to make it a little bit easier. So xshow.transition is all you need to do. And now if I hit show modal, it transitions beautifully. But I did this yesterday for a bunch of people, and they all told me you can't see it over Zoom. So there's extra flexibility. You could actually do duration dot, let's say 1000. And now I hit show modal, and there, it whooshes in slowly, and it whooshes out gradually. There's tons of flexibility here. I want to talk your ear off for the rest of the talk about it, but we don't have time. So because you can't even see it, we're lobbing it off. Fine. Okay, so we have our modal. Now you want to use this all over your app. What do? Well, you copy and paste it everywhere, right? Just like Tailwind, like accept the ugly, copy and paste it all over your app. That's a horrible idea. I would hate to do that. So the same recommendation that Tailwind has when people say, oh, but what about, a nice little BTN class for Tailwind? Well, Adam would say, well, extract it into a component, like a backend Blade component. So Alpine has the same recommendation. And because Blade components are now like the best thing in the entire world and have answered all of my problems that I ever had, Alpine works beautifully with them, and it's a really nice experience. So we can say x-modal, we'll create our little Blade component, and we'll say x slot, and we'll make a slot for this, trigger, okay? And then here's the default slot. We'll put that button inside the trigger slot, and then we'll put modal content inside the default slot. Okay, and then we'll take this whole thing and we'll pop it in a component. And like Taylor showed you, there's anonymous components. So here's the workflow for real. When you upgrade to Laravel 7, this is how you make this work. Create a new folder called components. Okay, step 1, done. Step 2, modal.blade.php. That's it. We just paste it in. We'll add in the little stuff. We'll add in this trigger thing so that we're listening for a trigger. We'll add in the slot thing so that so that we paste in the trigger, and then we are also pasting in the slot. Okay. Load it up in the browser, and it works. It's beautiful. But there's one little tiny hangup. Inside of this trigger slot, I have this @click open equals true, which to me feels like I'm leaking some concern out of the component into the slot. I hate doing that. So because of browsers and the way they just delegate events automatically, we could take that and we could put it inside the modal component. So let's wrap this in a div. We'll paste in that open equals true. And now when anything is clicked inside of the slot, we're going to catch it up here and set open to true. So now I'm using this little reusable component everywhere. And all you have to worry about is what you want it to look like inside here. You can make it an SVG, an A, whatever. There's some accessibility things that you're going to want to think about, but for the most part, it's up to you. We're only concerned with non-modal showing and hiding related things, which I love. Cool. So putting it all together, let's stick this create repo inside of here and check it out. Show modal. Now we have our little create repo component inside the modal. Say foo, create, get out of there, search for foo, and there it is. Beautiful. So one last thing here. We had to manually close the modal. That is no bueno. We want Livewire to tell Alpine to close the modal. So how do we do that? Well, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but here's what I would do for a modal. We can add another listener for a custom event called close modal. We're going to listen for it, and we'll actually listen for it on the window level. Okay? And then when we get that close modal event, we're going to set open equal false. Now, just so you know, anywhere else in your app, you could have like a button and at click, and there's this little dispatch helper. So you can dispatch a native custom event like close modal, and that'll work. It'll close the modal from anywhere else, right? And just to further demonstrate for you, because I'm guessing you aren't building your own JavaScript frameworks like I am and having to deal with custom events all the time, but because this is an API I wasn't really that familiar with. But dispatch event, new custom event, close modal. All right, we show the modal, I dispatch this event, and nothing happens because the demo gods are out for the day. So we're going to refresh, and hopefully that solves it all. And it does. There we go. So just so you know that this is native browser stuff, it's not like more wacky APIs that Alpine's forcing you to, consume. You can listen for any custom event from any third-party package. All right, so that's good, but what does that have to do with Livewire? So from a Livewire component, like create repo, we can actually dispatch native browser events. So we could say dispatch browser event, close modal. You can pass params in and do all sorts of cool things. Now we're showing modal, we type final repo. Hit enter, it closes automatically. Final repo is now made available. There we go. I want to emphasize that Alpine and Livewire work beautifully together, and Alpine and Laravel Blade, those new Blade 7 components work unbelievable. It's like a match made in heaven. There are so many cool things that I've been tinkering with myself, like X form inputs and X like date pickers for my apps, and using Alpine to wrap up all that nasty implementation inside of a nice little custom component. So I'm extremely excited for the future of those APIs. Great, so that is it. Back to slides, and then I'll show you a couple more things. How are we doing on time? We're doing all right, great. In 45 minutes, we just made a fancy interactive UI. Thanks for watching. No JS files, barely any JavaScript. We had to write some in Alpine, but it was a pleasure. No NPM run watch at all. No build or anything to manage. Fast, flexible tests that cover all the way from the database to the template. So I dare you to try it. It's very easy to install. It's less than 1 minute. There's zero config, no publishing, no middleware, no nothing. It supports Laravel 5.6 and above. This is something that I have a heart for old Laravel projects because I feel like I've been stuck on a bunch of them where, like something new comes out on and it's Laravel 7 only. And you're like, oh, well, I'll use that thing when I do that new side project that I'll never launch. Well, I don't want it to be that way. There's no reason that Livewire can't support old versions of Laravel. So we've tried pretty hard to keep it supporting newer versions of Laravel. And Dries Vince was really awesome in making this support Laravel 7 and also below 7. Cool. And it's as small as you want. So it doesn't have to be a full buy-in thing. I think that's like a myth I want to break. You don't have to think, I'll use Livewire in my next project, or I'll, farm this whole section of my app out to Livewire. Add one little component in your nav bar. Add a search component, something small. It's totally fine. It's not going to overtake your app or encourage you to do your whole app in Livewire. So there we go. I also want to flash to you Project L. It's a project I'm working on that's completely done in Livewire and Alpine. And the purpose of it is to be a place where everybody can go and say, how would Caleb build that in Livewire? How would Caleb or how would somebody, what's the Livewire or Alpine way of doing that? And I mean like complex things like image uploads with cropping inside of a form, like infinite scroll, all done in Livewire. I literally built a Trello clone with only Livewire, 0 lines of JavaScript, and a massive data table. You can sort, you can filter, there's bulk actions, it all updates in the query string. Project L is not out yet, but I want it to be the place where we all go to basically work on the best way to do things in Livewire, and then you can go and reference the code freely. So I want to note that Project L, when it does come out, is going to be private to my GitHub sponsors only. So if you want, you can go sign up to be a sponsor, and within the next couple of weeks, you'll be hearing from me. It starts at $9 a month, and eventually, when I have enough sponsors, I'll release a tier, but when I have enough sponsors, I'll open source Project L. So I don't know what that number is, but when I reach that number, Project L will be open source and we can all reference it freely, no paywall. Cool. So go check out Alpine, go check out Livewire. There are 100 million other things that I did not cover in this little session. You can nest components. There's an event system to talk to each other, pagination, redirecting, authorization. There's polling, there's prefetching. I dare you to go get your mind bent with prefetching. An entire section on Alpine JS for making them work really well together. SPA mode, basically it works insanely well with turbolinks. Just add turbolinks to your app and it works great. You can do route Livewire, make it feel like an inertia type SPA type thing. A million other test API things. I could go on and on and on. And now, the moment of truth. Let's tag. Big deep breath. 1.0. I actually accidentally tagged this last night and had to delete the tag. Somebody messaged me and said, did you mean to do this? All right, publish release. Drum roll, please. There we go. Livewire 1.0 is now tagged. There's a nice upgrade guide. Shouldn't take you too long to upgrade. And a full change log. Let's all go build stuff on the internet. Thank you.
It's like there's only a crowd of one here, but
Thanks, Ian.
Well, that's awesome. That's really cool that you did it live here at Laracon Online. That's amazing. But no, Livewire is like, I feel like this is the year. It's like Laravel 7, Tailwind UI, Livewire, and Alpine. Like, this is what I need to find my side project I'm never going to ship, but I need to find something I'm never going to ship so I can build something with these things, because it's just so exciting. And just, I mean, for like, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. Like, this is what it was supposed to be like, and we were lied to along the way and all that stuff. But now it's like, finally, like things work together and they work nicely and they're not overly complicated, and it's just wonderful. So I'm really excited.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, really great stuff.
Sweet.
All right, man. Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.